Today is a workshop on how to be a lot more effective in one-on-one conversations. I think often, though, the key to becoming more effective at something difficult is to realize just how difficult it is. And so I want to just make totally clear how difficult I think one-on-one conversations are, particularly with the conventional approach. And I think the conventional approach is to try to give somebody one or more facts to change their mind. And there's something very right about that, and then there's something very wrong about that. And I call this the context chasm. So let's take an example. I've lived most of the past couple years in San Francisco. So I've basically only lived my whole life in places that are either neutral toward fossil fuels or quite hostile. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so that would count as quite hostile. And San Francisco certainly is another level. And so let's take a situation that would come up that I think is indicative of the challenges that we face. So let's go back to the time when President Trump decided to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. So this was a significant decision. A lot of people were upset about it. I, as you might imagine, being author of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, was happy with that decision. And most people in San Francisco, as you can imagine, were unhappy with that decision. Now, let's say I'm in a conversation with someone, and I'm not talking about someone from Greenpeace or Sierra Club or somebody whose whole identity is bound up in being anti-fossil fuels. I'm just talking about somebody who's heard the narrative through the conventional channels that fossil fuels are destroying the planet and need to be replaced by solar and wind. Let's say I'm in a conversation with them. How does it go? Well, normally it goes pretty badly. And not for me anymore, but the default is it goes pretty badly. And to understand why it goes badly, we need to understand how different our starting points are. The starting points between a supporter and a non-supporter of fossil fuels are hugely different. So I think of a lot of persuasion as they're at point A, I'm at point B, and I'm trying to bring them closer. Right? That's what it is. So, and one way to think of point A and point B that I like to use is to think of them as contexts. So a context is basically the sum of everything you know or think you know. So that's your starting point in a conversation, the sum of everything you know or think you know. Now, let's talk about, just with this one issue, the Paris Climate Accords, let's talk about what are the differences between, let's just say, Joe's context and Alex's context. So now Joe's starting viewpoint is we should stay with the Paris Climate Accord, at minimum probably do something more extreme, but at least stay. And my conclusion is we should not. But if I were to ask Joe, give me as many reasons as possible why we need to stick with the Paris Climate Accords, what do you think Joe would say? So let's just, no particular order. I mean, come on, you guys got to read national newspapers. Let's piggyback on that. Like, solar is now cheaper than coal and gas. Oil companies aren't paying the full cost of their pollution. Batteries are now cheaper. Look what Elon Musk did in Australia. There's a storage revolution, so the unreliability of the sun and the wind are no longer a problem.
It's going to be a cleaner environment.
Yeah, of course. We're going to dramatically lower pollution. China, if we keep using fossil fuels, China is just going to get dirtier and dirtier.
One of we're not there, we're not in charge, and it won't happen.
You mean of the Paris climate? Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different kinds of leadership considerations, and there's a lot of rhetoric about how, look, even just what are we doing? We're the only country that's not joined on to this. What kind of primitive country would just think that it's right and the rest of the world is wrong, and we need to be a leader, and instead we're back in the Stone Ages. And we haven't even talked about we're being climate change deniers. I mean, if you oppose this treaty, you must be a climate change denier. So let's say we've come up with conservatively 20 different pieces of context in Joe's context. Now, probably most of you, and certainly I, would disagree to some degree with every one of those things. So that seems very difficult, right? Because we don't have too much time in a conversation. But it gets more difficult because what happens, let's just say I want to take one issue. I decide the solution to this is I'm going to treat all of Joe's wrong ideas as just individual problems to be solved separately. So let's say the first one I'm going to deal with is Joe, we didn't bring this one up, but Joe says, like, global warming is a huge problem. This is we keep setting, it keeps being the hottest year on record. We're having like multiple hottest year on record, which is disturbing. So let's say I think, okay, I have a really clever argument against that, which I do. Right? So one argument I have against that is that, well, if you look at the trend of warming, there was warming before significant human CO2 emissions, and then we'd expect mild warming from human CO2 emissions. So if that's the case, then any given year, if we're still in a natural warming period with our own warming added, every year is likely to be one of the warmest years to date. But it doesn't mean it's a problem as long as the warming is not too much. Like if I gained 1/100 of a pound every year, I'm always in my fattest year on record, right? But doesn't mean there's a problem. So let's say, I say that kind of thing. Then the person will say, well, like, oh, I know I read that, you're a climate change denier. I read this different study, or it's actually, the models predict this, and then I go into the models. And what happens usually when I try to refute one of the facts is we just get in an argument about that. And if that gets anywhere near resolution, we just jump into something else. And there's still this chasm. There's just this huge separation between Joe and me. And those of you who've spoken to people who are conventionally educated or miseducated on this subject must have experienced this. You just get in a discussion, it just goes on and on and on in all these different directions, and you just feel like I can't get through at all. Does it sound familiar at all? So I want to put it bluntly, depress you first, just so that we can respect the problem. There's a real problem in bringing someone from context A to context B. Like ideally what I want to do is if I had infinite time, what I would like to do is kind of three things. I would like to add as many relevant true facts, actual facts that Joe doesn't know. I'd like to add that to his context. B, I'd like to subtract any falsehoods that I could. And C, I'd like to modify any confusions. So like hottest year on record, sort of true, but you're not thinking about it quite the right way. And that's what we always want to do in communication. I think of it as bridging a context. We build a bridge. We want to add, subtract, and modify. But if we just do it on the level of individual facts, it doesn't work very well for the reasons that I gave. So what do we do? Any ideas on how you can break through? All right, good. So, want to hear the answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
So the way I get to the answer is asking a question. Why are the contexts so different? Like, why are the contexts so different? Because it kind of seems natural that, like, oh, he thinks these 150 different things than I think. But there's also something weird about that. Like, we shouldn't take it for granted that needs to be the case. There's something going on under the surface that is causing it. So one way I think of this is, am I fighting cobras or am I fighting a hydra? So cobras, we all know what cobras are, right? These deadly serpents. And you have cobras, they're just these individual things and they attack you. And if you've got 150 cobras after you, you just got to kill them in sequence, one after another. They're sort of these separate different things. Now the hydra is this creature from Greek mythology. It's quite different. So it's this multi-headed monster, and each of the heads can kill you on its own. But what happens if you try to chop off the first head of the hydra? Anyone know the story? To grow back. So a cobra problem is one that you can fight sequentially, where it's just individual things. A hydra problem is one where you need to fight it fundamentally. You need to look at the heart of it. And there is a heart of the problem that leads to us having such different contexts. And what's fascinating about it is that it's actually way easier to change the heart than to change the individual heads. So you might think like the hardest thing, because all the heads are so powerful, like the hardest thing might be to cut out the heart, but it turns out it's not the hardest thing. It's actually much easier to cut out the heart than even one